Or did you think you should wait? Or? Okay, all right. Who can tell a joke? Idle, not appropriate joke. Here, and you have to come down here. Yeah. Ben, you got one? Gretchen? No one's got a joke?
I got a joke.
All right. Sarah's got a joke. Sarah, let's see here.
What's the difference between a giraffe and a tractor? One has hydraulics, the other has hybolics.
Okay, another joke. Where's Margie? She has jokes. Derek, any jokes? Yeah. You must have one.
I got one, all right.
All right.
Knock, knock.
No, you gotta come down.
Oh, man.
For the listening audience. Otherwise, it'll just be a voice.
It's very childish.
Derek Shapiro.
Don't expect much. All right. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
I eat my. I eat my poo.
Yeah, any jokes? You have one.
I did, but no. Yeah, you heard a lot this week afterwards.
Richard, any jokes?
Not lately.
Okay. All right, we're just waiting for Cody, then we'll get started. But this is the this is the 2 p.m. talk. Amy, any jokes?
Not very funny, sorry.
Well,
I have trouble with jokes because, like, I can't focus on the humor. I get more hung up in the fact that it's a performance, and then I get thrown off. So it's not really a joke.
That's pretty funny.
I mean, everybody's laughing, but
it is a performance.
No.
Saul, any jokes?
yeah.
And then Timmy can be the same one.
Ooh, that's fun.
Wow.
Mood lighting, what do you like?
Probably darker on the screen.
Of course, I gotta look at turtle jokes.
Oh, we're gonna.
You want this way?
I think that's good.
So in terms of the stream, it'll be, the slides will look great, but you will be in shadows, so.
Oh, you could turn it on a little bit. Nice.
That work?
Are the slides? Can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Maybe just a little darker. I think it's perfect. Well, not on me. I think the disembodied voice effect is probably not necessary.
We want to see more.
Yeah.
There you go.
I don't think it is.
All right.
Yeah.
I think we're good, Cody. Thank you. All right, everyone. Thanks for coming. I want this to be both a lecture and a discussion, so keep track of, I guess, the various themes here. It's layered. Like the last talk, I'm doing a couple things. I'm talking about ideas, and I'm also showing slides and places. So I'll talk a little bit about the photo and also about the text and trying to weave the two together. This is a slide you're familiar with from the cowboy professionalism talk a few weeks ago, but we're skiing from the summit of Mount Sanford. The name of this talk, Powerful and Privileged, Crisis and Affirmation in Alaska's Mountain Culture, is part of the UAS Power and Privilege Symposium, so thanks all for being here. I lost a friend this year, a lot of us did. Ryan Johnson is on the backside of the towers, and so when I say identity crisis, it's partly my own, because I self-identify as a mountaineer. And so Ryan and I were the youngest members of an expedition from here in 2003 to Nepal. And we were climbing high mountains, combination of alpine style and expedition style. We spent some time, 6 weeks actually, in the Khumbu region of the Himalaya, and then came down to Kathmandu, which is high enough, 5,000 feet, but nowhere near where we were. We spent 5 weeks at 17,000 feet, which is higher than most places in the Western Hemisphere. And so we were in the Tamil district, it's a tourist district in Kathmandu when it was all said and done. And I was talking to a young woman, and Ryan sat down and he said, "Every time Forrest and I tie into a rope, we accept death." Rolled my eyes just like I just did. And I said, "Actually, we accept life." And Ryan slammed his hand and walked out. But we've always been philosophically different in, I think, what the rope means. He showed up the next day, he was filthy. He'd gotten lost and otherwise derailed. And so I'm trying to figure this out, why we all keep getting hurt, why my friends are dying. So this is the fourth highest mountain in the world, that's Lhotse. From Pingboche, there are these Sherpani villages in upland Himalaya where you stay, and they serve coffee, they have yaks. It's very agricultural, and so climbers, primarily Western climbers, are traveling, bringing their plastic waste because the water's mostly ruined, traveling through this place to go to the mountains. So these people are facilitating this kind of globalized flow of 20th and 21st century mountaineering. The hills in the Himalaya have been denuded by mountaineers who in the early days were burning fire or burning wood for fire, for heat, for cooking. And so there's very much been an impact. There's trash on all over the high mountains. There's 14 8,000 meter peaks in the world, and they're all in the Himalaya. And so it's an obvious attraction if you identify with the mountain culture, with the mountain concept. But I think this is what I've come up with, that mountain culture suffers from toxic masculinity, meaning gender is constructed and that being a man limits men, the traditional norms of the male role. So here an emphasis on competition, status, toughness, emotional stoicism, and certain male problems, aggression and violence, devaluation of women, fear and hatred of homosexuals, detached fathering, neglect of health needs are unfortunate but predictable results of the male socialization process. It's not just this culture, I think it's our culture. In other words, to continue being a man in mountain culture, a man must continue risking his life in the pursuit of mountain summits. This is not to say that women don't have a history in American mountain culture, but rather that gender affects how and why men and women participate in activities like climbing and skiing, and more generally with culture writ large. And so here's Ariel Svetlik and Chelsea Bamba schwacking through dense brush in Hot Springs Creek, approaching the Aragetch, Athabascan word for fingers outstretched. So Central Brooks Range, we were there on a capstone trip in 2014 and were lucky enough with the weather to climb Shot Tower, which is a beautiful 8,000 foot, 12 pitch granite tower. So the stories we tell, narratives we write, they're relational to our culture, and ours is a power culture. Are we people of sport, of nation, of region? Americans are culturally placeless. We took over the place, but don't have deep ties with much of it. We, the powerful and privileged, haven't lived here very long. Where we were this weekend in Cowie Drainage, there are trees older than the United States, which is, that's really remarkable that we still have an existing old growth ecosystem here in the Tongass. But it does speak to how short our country's actually been here. Our culture protects national parks, argues about public lands, stands for salmon or stands for everything else, but ignores poverty, inequities in wealth, and barriers to the American dream. And this is one of my few first ascents. This is Whiskey Tang in the Central Alaska Range, Little Switzerland. Climbing is placed in certain locations and at certain seasons, but for almost all participants, this means it requires travel by car or plane from one's home to a destination. An obvious barrier to entry for many Americans. Participation is as much about class and privilege as it is about our cultural mythos of independence from control. And these are my friends. This is Stefan Ritchie. Many of you know Bjorn Dila. Bjorn and I were really just young men at this time. Stefan was a mentor of ours. And we'll come back to Stefan. He appears again. But we're at the top of the Ham and Eggs Couloir on the Moose's Tooth here. We jet-setting Alaskan rock climbers regularly fly to Las Vegas, walk Fremont Street, retire to our hotels, and then wake up and take our rental car 45 minutes out of town to the Red Rock Wilderness and its mythic freedom. But if the hapless rock tourist takes a wrong turn and continues down Fremont, the humanity at the bottom of the hill is not entertaining and certainly not mythic. In fact, at the bottom of the hill in Lake Mead, only 2 miles from the old strip, people are poor. Skin is sagging, possessions are carried around in plastic garbage bags, and survival seems questionable. Credit cards are not taken at gas stations. This dystopia is the same throughout the American West. And why are we talking about it? That's Black Velvet Canyon, 2,000 feet of near vertical rock. Climbing is often historicized as a countercultural activity, an act of rebellion from the mainstream, the quote-unquote freedom of the hills. As early as 1972, the upsurge in the popularity of the sport led Yosemite ace Royal Robbins to observe that more people, in fact, equaled less freedom, so much so that Royal retired from climbing. Mountaineering has never been more popular or more consumerist. Think about the incredible variety of highly engineered, ultralight, ultra-strong gear, the proliferation of climbing gyms, or perhaps most strikingly, indoor rock climbing headlining as an Olympic sport in 2020? How did mountaineering become a fitness sport, an indoor sport? This change is a function of the sport's popularity. Kochi's stronghold, look at that. Radical. And what about the dirtbag? Our preferred mid-century hero. Privilege and white male identity transposed from Jack Kerouac to Fred Becky. Sure, yes, there's existential meaning here, but questionable social purpose. In fact, popularization and commercialization make the dirtbag myth one more product of consumption. An adventure narrative we can and do purchase with our hashtag van life. This is my friend Andy Stearns. We're on top of Cathedral Peak. First ascent by John Muir in the 1870s. Tuolumne. So what happened? I don't know exactly. What happened to the frontier mythos of equality and hard work equating to democracy? What happened to the miners' meeting and conflict resolution through consensus? Everyone has an equal voice, or so our Constitution reads. The land of the free. The idea is that if we have equal opportunity, then we have equality. And this is the Arctic. Battleship Rock. Very wet, very lush, very fragile. But equality is not the freedom manifested by the mountain culture. It's certainly not the ideology of the power culture. The freedom of the hills is simply the freedom to spend our disposable income on the artifacts of late capitalism. Beautiful skis, precision cast cams. It's the freedom to ignore the accumulation of stuff we mostly keep in storage, to ignore the decadence of our power, of our spending, of the bankruptcy of our nation. So what is the conflict of this story? Climbing is now less authentic, less rebellion. Is it still worth doing? Why risk our lives for something whose most aesthetic alpine form celebrates incredible risk-taking? Especially if the underlying ideology of mountaineering is morally bankrupt and toxically masculine. Time travel to 2016. I was in the hospital and took a phone call. What the fuck happened? That's Stefan. That's just how he speaks. This was in relation to me and the bear. The same thing this March, 7 a.m., out of the blue. Same exact sentence, this time in relation to Ryan. We really don't have control. Doesn't matter how hard we train physically or mentally, how well laid out our risk management plan is. And I am certain at this point, it is not heroic to die climbing. This is a brown bear footprint on the Chulitna River. This is a 6,000 meter peak, Tamsurku, the Himalaya. Even while acknowledging mountain sport as privileged and vocalizing my skepticism that this type of human activity necessarily makes the world a better place, more democratic, equitable, etc., I will continue to participate. And the question then is why? If all these things are true, if the identity crisis is, then why continue? Why not just quit? Well, it's culturally coded. It's heady stuff. I'm male. My mother described me as a high testosterone man, which may be a little uncomfortable, but Weirdly, sometimes climbing makes me feel powerful, but just as often it makes me feel weak and secure. Thinking about it is emotionally extreme. Those in of themselves are not good reasons to keep climbing. But actual participation in climbing and skiing, the act of doing the thing, there's really nothing like it. And I mean that. I mean that in this way that words may not articulate, especially when shared. The best days of my life have occurred sharing landscapes like mountains and oceans. And more interestingly, those natural settings were and are a backdrop for self-actualization, which I can only best describe by analogy. This is the ice climb car wash on the road above Skagway with an ice climbing class. Intense outdoor experiences are much like the Zen Buddhist concept of no mind, Mushen, the mind without mind, a mind not fixed or occupied by thought or emotion, a mind open to everything. This is from the Chilcats looking at our ice field. You can see the Herbert River there. Likewise, Cheech Mahaley's concept of flow, of being in the zone, a complete absorption in what one is doing, leading to a loss in one's sense of space and time. This is my dad and I looking out at the Ingram Glacier on Mount Rainier. And as often as the social side of these experiences can be categorized and coded, it is just as likely the primary justification for continuing to participate. Wellness and democracy in small groups is a powerful primer for the potential of human experience. And masculinity does not need to be toxic. This is Mike Miller. We climbed Nun Mountain in the Chilcats a few years ago. It was our first ascent. And what about wild places? Isn't their less developed and less populated character another manifestation of the power culture's hegemony? Why live in Alaska if the climbing is better in California? Isn't nature just a construction? That's a Gunsight Pass, Lower Taku, going to the Northwest Fork mountaineering course. Wildlands are a classroom for humility, for commitment and consequence, for the exploration of our own mortality. Living in Alaska is my first and final position of privilege, and I believe there is still freedom in these hills. So now I'd like to build on that with some discussion. These are the questions. How do gender norms affect you? Is mountain sport compatible with our environmental precarity? Have you ever entered a flow state? What solutions do you imagine for our culturally conspicuous consumption? Thanks.
Lights up a little bit.
Have some pieces of paper. Does anyone want to try? Hayati, any of those questions? Have you thought about gender norms? So the last talk was really about women. And this talk obviously is more about men. Have pieces of paper. I think,
I have a question.
oh, good.
Do you think with us kind of like entering into this time where gender is now being recognized more as a spectrum, as we're not putting these definite labels on it, maybe getting that effect now as we progress throughout like the next generation and where boy, girl, male, female, knowledge?
Yes. In fact, one of the best classes I took in college was a history of sex and gender, and the norming process will probably still be very much the same. In general, we should be trending towards more tolerant. And so what I'm trying to do here is sort of reckon or figure out why people do this at all, and to the point that they'll die doing it. And I do think that it relates to these gender norms of, what I'm terming here is toxic masculinity. Like the virtue of commitment and the understanding of consequences is no small thing, but dying for a mountain, as much as we like to justify that when it happens, that's not worth it. That's my opinion. It's just my opinion.
So Forrest, speaking to that, I think the paradigm sort of oscillates, for me at least, right? There's a piece of it of being in this flow state where it's very easy to take a misstep and not be calculating the different opportunities that are available or the risks, right, of getting those. So the trying to hit your questions for discussion, there's a piece of me that in some cases is very competitive when outdoors. There's parts of me that also is very sort of mousy, right? I understand that our wildness around us is a very potentially catastrophic place. And I find it interesting that while I'm in that flow state, it's very easy to sort of miss the what the risks or opportunities are. I don't know if that resonates for you or otherwise.
What was your question? Sorry.
Well, it's that the gender norms. There are times where I feel mousy, or I feel very.
By mousy, do you mean feminine?
Perhaps. I don't know that I would classify it with gender, but it's the brave versus fearful. Right? Perhaps that's And so being in a flow state, for me, that premise of being in the moment, I lose that observation of my masculinity, or whatever that nature is, but it also means that it increases the risk for me in some cases.
Yeah, and we know there are inherent risks in all of the outdoor studies, skills classes, and what I'm really trying to examine or think about is more that covert social coding that comes with, kind of an unwritten code of expectations. And so to Margie's point, as we move to openly acknowledging gender as a spectrum, maybe mountain climbing will become less likely to be fatal as it continues on in its history. There's a risk to reward continuum in the sport, and it's the most aesthetic line. The most aesthetic climb is often the most bold, which also by default makes it the most dangerous, and that's problematic for me at this point. And I think it relates to this general cultural insecurity that we have about meaning. And so most of the people dying in this sport are men. Most of the people caught in avalanches, regardless of age, are men. And what's up with that? What are we trying to prove? Like, I had to wrestle a bear before. I was like, you know what? I'm good, but I'm not. I'm like, I look at mountains and I want to climb them. I feel compelled. Not because I think of it as dangerous. I think of it as beautiful. I think of it like visually aesthetic, but in this kind of like fully engaged way. It's very real for me. It might be completely constructed and imagined, but it's very real for me and for other people in this room. I just think that the stories we tell about it, about like the justification for why we're doing it, are very gendered, especially when it gets into the levels of commitment that can lead to the likelihood of death. So like Alex Honnold, right? He falls off, he's going to die. There's just no question. It's unlikely he's going to fall off, but on the other hand, it's very likely that he's eventually going to fall off. Most of the soloists in history fall off. The Dawn Wall film, nothing dangerous about that. That was surprisingly all about this incredibly hard rock climb. Nothing to do with risking your life necessarily. Like each of those moves is protected by a bolt or a cam. It's choreographed to a point that Tommy Caldwell, Kevin Jorgensen, they've been working on that thing for 8 years. But this is not the kind of like last ditch effort, send it to the top thing at all. They're going to climb it or they're not, but they're not going to fall to their deaths. And that's a refreshing story. Okay, who else? Thanks, Cody.
Forrest, I have a question. Would you attribute the term summit fever? Do you think that could be directly correlated to what you're talking about with toxic masculinity and this idea to push beyond your health norms and stuff to continue on and push to it? Do you think that, the idea that you get caught up in the summit when everything around you is telling you that you need to turn back, but you have to keep pushing forward to get to the summit? Do you think that the toxic masculinity and culture can be directly correlated to that idea of summit fever?
Yes. I think that, and this was interesting with my thesis research, because skiers are a lot less prone to summit fever. They're more group-oriented and less goal-oriented, and climbers really are more goal-oriented and sort of less interpersonally oriented because they're so goal-oriented. And so you see this kind of like breakdown in humanity that the John Waterman reading is the classic example, right? They're like climbing the Cassine in winter, 8,000 foot, rock, snow, and ice, Alaska grade 5, never been repeated. It's 1982. And it's a state-of-the-art climb. And these three basically expert climbers have a terrible interpersonal relationship to the point that John, the narrator, the climbing ranger, is left by his partners. He's fully abandoned. The only reason he survives is because he gets up while suffering from high altitude pulmonary edema and drags himself down the regular route. And when he gets to their high camp on the descent, they barely acknowledge him because he's been weak. That's the toxic masculinity that I'm talking about.
I just have a question about Alex Honnold, because on one hand, you're talking about it in terms of toxic masculinity, but at least with his public persona, he's not that at all, right? He doesn't. There's no bravado. There's no competitiveness. There's none of that. What do you think about that in terms of like?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's more of, well, I respect what Alex is doing. That should be stated. And I hope he doesn't fall off. Yeah, I think like anything, there's a lot of ego wrapped up in what he's doing. And it's curious that it's become so commercial. Because it wasn't at first. I mean, he just kind of got discovered, and then everything since then has been this amazing rock climber who free solos everything really fast. But he kind of existed before that, and it had nothing to do with the attention. And not that it does necessarily now, but it does seem to change things. So I don't know. I do feel, this is not an answer to it, I do feel gripped watching him. I bet we all do.
So a couple of things. I'm not a climber, so I can't really relate to that culture. I have grown up in Alaska my whole life, but I was a skier. I was raised by a former ski racer, and I can definitely relate to a lot of like this sort of toxic masculinity appearing in competitiveness across the sport. But I've had the opportunity to grow up in a time where everyone is skiing, like of all genders. It doesn't matter. But that same sort of competitiveness still exists, and I think it has forever. All my favorite skiers have died in Shane McConkey and Doug Coombs, and the first ones that come to mind, who have died in these extreme sports. So I think it's just maybe a conflict of generations, but I don't necessarily see that competitiveness as being a product of toxic masculinity. Perhaps in other sports, but in skiing, I don't exactly see that. Which maybe it might be a generational thing, but I was wondering your take on that.
Well, and you know, Kevin Crine has made this point before, but it's only recently that skiers started dying, and climbers have sort of been dying from the beginning. I do think it's a wicked learning environment. It's a poor feedback environment. I say this in my classes. So you can do everything right or do everything wrong and not really know. You know, and with McConkey and Coombs, the stakes are obviously very high. It's not really very different from what Holland's doing. I don't think of them as toxically masculine. I don't really think of Alex Honnold that way. But they're participating at a level where.
At that point, to me, it's just man versus nature. You know, I wouldn't see any sort of like competition between peoples, because I think that's part of what's attractive about any of these sort of extreme outdoor sports is that there's an element of escapism to it. And every great explorer, from John Muir to whoever else. I mean, even you could talk about Chris McCandless, who I'm not a huge fan of, but he was still pursuing the exact same mentality as any awesome young outdoor person nowadays. And it's just a pursuit of escapism. So I'm just a little bit confused as to how like this sort of the toxicity of toxic masculinity is creeping in at that high level.
Yeah, it may not be.
Yeah.
I think it's creeping in my friend group over time. It's been there since the beginning. I think it may not be why top tier athletes are participating at all. But in that slide I showed of the Moose's tooth, we had a breakdown of humanity. Didn't really make sense that we kept going and climbed that thing, but we did, because, you know, it wasn't. It was uncomfortable and awkward. I mean, if you were to understand the stereotype, you don't talk, right? You're stoic or you yell. Men are assholes to men. That's sort of how it works.
And to women.
And to women.
Especially
to women.
I wonder if, like the way that I understand toxic masculinity is deeply connected with capitalism and patriarchy, which kind of connects with some of your thinking around man versus nature. It's the way that we have objectified the sacred living of all human things, including brown people, women, you know, anything that's not the white masculine sort of norm. And so my sense is that the toxicity is what we've inherited. It's what we've all inherited, whether you're a woman or a man. As a woman, I have to navigate the reality of patriarchy and the way that I've internalized sexism and toxic masculinity as much as a man does in a different way. And so, yeah, my sense is it's all deeply interrelated, and sometimes like a fish in water, it's hard to see based on how much privilege you live with. And so listening deeply and connecting with different people's experiences can help broaden out. And, you know, my other thought is, like, I was thinking about my relationship to nature since I became a mom. And it really shifted because I started spending a lot more time watching the ripples of a rock in the water, not like pushing to make it to the top of some epic adventure. And, you know, so I think for all of us, as we're navigating issues of, you know, the impacts of patriarchy and colonialism, and as we're doing the work to self-actualize, we have the opportunity to whether it's in sports or work or whatever the realm is, we have the opportunity to continue to deconstruct the norm. Because, I mean, of course you see toxic masculinity in mountain sport because that's what's asked of men to do. Men are expected and asked to be strong, to be angry, to be stoic, to dominate, to take what they want when they want it, to objectify. I mean, it's what we've inherited, I think. So I think whatever sport or whatever wherever you are, you still have the opportunity to say, okay, I love to climb mountains and I can't give this up. This fuels me, and how do I engage in a way that like starts to deconstruct how toxic it is for everyone? Because I think wherever you are, we can do that work of healing, and that's the work. I hope. I mean, that's what I want.
Yeah, that's just interesting to me because, I mean, I'm one of the younger people in this room on my team. I've grown up in America that really focuses on social justice, which is, of course, a great thing. But what I'm starting to see as I work with kids that are younger than me, and I'm a music teacher, I'm a musician as well, is I see far less of what we refer to as toxic masculinity and patriarchal like suppression and white suppression in our younger generations. I think that there's something to be said about how far we've come at this point, where me at being 19, a lot of the time, of course, I'm hearing about all of this and then coming to events like these, I purely honestly have not seen that in kids my age and younger than me. So I think there's something to be said where there is change happening, and because kids my age have been growing up, learning in a culture that already supported all of these types of studies.
It's a weird feedback loop in that here in this space, we're in as tolerant a place as there may be in the entire nation. And Juneau, voting blue, is a bubble compared to a lot of Alaska, a lot of industries in Alaska. It doesn't at all demean or limit your experiences, but I mean, that is one of those benefits of going other places, is just exposing oneself to more than just here. And this is a wonderful place to live, but even the university is a bit of a fishbowl, right? I mean, this is the sort of like, this is the place for ideas. It's the place for argument and debate without punching. It's like, it's where we come to sort of grow into the potential of ourselves as human beings who are communicators. But that's not a lot of the state, and it's certainly not a lot of the country. Not to say that it couldn't be or it shouldn't.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring
I mean, for goodness sake, there's 3 hate crimes last week in this country.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just speaking from my own personal experience.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Allison.
Just as a
just to kind of underlie what you're saying, one of the things, two things that have always kind of struck me is I've seen hundreds of ski films. And there's always a female skier in there, or Victoria Julie, or Angel Collinson. And it's inevitable where, the highest compliment that is always given is, she skis like a boy, she skis like a guy, she boards like a boy. That's why they're in there. So I'm always waiting and I'm always listening for that to come through. And many of the Angel Collinson, mostly, her ski style is literally stand on top of that and go straight down. So there's no turns at this point. It's just, and a lot of that is, she's an incredible skier, but also modern equipment allows you to, pull that off. But I find that interesting. Another thing, if you're looking for confirmation written on the mountains, you can look at any map where there are climbing routes or skiing routes, and they've been named. And they've got some pretty sketchy names. Would you like to contribute some names?
Worst probably did a better job. Yeah.
But there's a lot of gendered names. I don't know how to say it. Some pretty inappropriate ones and everything. And I find that really interesting. It's kind of like sexual degradation, mountain culture, like route naming. There's a number around here, but I'm not gonna go there. I'm a lady.
Right.
Vote like a lady. I can kind of answer a couple of these questions, and again, my own personal experience. The reason I didn't go here to this university to get an outdoor studies degree, for lots of reasons we're talking about in this room today, like how can I validate that? Like how can I rationalize that decision as a young woman today? Because I want to, because I can, to prove that I can do it, go and climb these mountains. I like to be there and I want to be up there, but how do I rationalize that behavior? And I do by participating in programs like the Juneau ISO Research Program that was started by good old white boy climbers from Harvard Mountain Club in the 40s. And it's changed a lot, and I've watched it grow just in the last 3 years that I've been involved. And I can tell you that at least in the last 3 or 4 years, 75% or so of the applicants are female or non-binary. And I think that's amazing. And the people who are in charge who are of the program today are women, queer, and killing it, and busting and working as hard as they can to make it a program where gender norms are being questioned and more people are being accepted into those environments where earth system science is just also a male-dominated field, and mountain sports are also, the powerful and privileged. So that's sort of how I rationalize what I do with my spare time, but it doesn't mean that I get to be up there where I want to be all the time.
One thing I wanted to say in the last talk, we have the transition that's happening at JERP. It's happening across the industry. I was just listening to NPR this morning, and there's women that lead the fly fishing outdoor experience ecotourism operation in Michigan. That's a complete role reversal from even a decade ago. This past summer, we have 2 program graduates, women guided middle-aged men to the summit of Denali. And I really wanted to say that in the last talk, and I didn't. But things are changing. I don't challenge that. And it's not me. This is not my generation that's going to make this happen. It's your generation. Like this, what's happening right now is the future. We're already mostly past tense. I'm just sort of facilitating, like voting today, being 18 to 22, you're the future. And Mm-hmm.
So this isn't really gender-based, it's just actually more on the technology side. My question is about, do you think that mountain climbing technology will keep advancing to aid climbing safety? Or do you think that it's gonna become less relevant in future years? Like because people will not do it as much, and that the advances in technology will discontinue?
Good question. The answer is probably if there's such a thing as a jetpack, suddenly the technology will be worth it in that you hit the button and you just fly away from an avalanche, but
That's what I meant. Fun, but still safe.
fun but still safe.
I don't think so.
So there's this great concept called risk homeostasis where we change our risk threshold that relates to this fingerprint that makes us a human being, and we change our risk threshold based on what kind of safety equipment we have. So we drive, perhaps, if you believe this, we drive more recklessly if we have a seatbelt on, or maybe ski with less snow stability assessment with a jetpack or even a beacon or a helmet. I think the technology will continue to improve, but it won't ever make a natural place free from, I guess, the uncertainty that makes it interesting. You're never going to.
And last, I just want to say, I'm not very big on climbing, but I did do the Chilkoot Trail a couple years ago, and that was a really fun experience for me and my family and friends. And I probably would do that one a lot if I could. It was a really fun experience to learn because I am a born Alaskan. I was born and raised here in Juneau my entire life. My mom was a Sitka. I don't know how to say that. She was born and raised in Sitka, and so were my brothers and here. And it's funny because my dad's not. He's from Arizona, but he loves everything about it here. He goes snowmobiling often up Dan Moeller, and I go with him, and we just enjoy. I enjoy being taught all that stuff. I was glad that I was brought up that way.
Yeah, it's a position of privilege. We're lucky people. Any further questions? Hey.
Hey, so I love, all the pictures and all, find a lot of places. I'm just wondering, how do you separate, what's the distinction between toxic masculinity and the great things that I'm seeing here between just masculinity? I don't summit super high peaks. I've gone 3,000, that's pretty good. It's not risky, but I know some of my friends, and I've had experiences that have come close to being severely injured. And I didn't think it was that risky. So what makes the distinction between masculine and then it goes into toxic masculine, something we want to avoid? What stand? Is it risk taking? Is it aggression?
I'm not the best at this, but it starts by using words. Meaning, a big part of the toxic masculinity shtick is that the participants, in this case men, aren't talking to each other, right? The assumptions are that everyone's strong, everyone's ready to go, and if you're not, you're weak, and probably sexed female, right? Or gay, or something. You're somehow less than. But there's nothing wrong with being male. That the photo of Mike Miller, all the positive experiences that people, regardless of gender, have with people of the same gender, those relate to a coding in our social understanding of how men and women work. The lines will continue to blur, but yeah, masculinity doesn't have to be toxic. It can be a lot of really positive things.
What could be positive about it? Because it sounds like when I was reading the definition, aggression, competition,
those are just things that are, I would say, masculine traits. And there's positive aspects to those being implemented. But yeah, in a way, it could be a very negative, putting it into negative aspect, like making someone feel less of themselves because there's a competition. In competition, there's someone better. So in what ways is masculine positive? Like what I saw was described as toxic masculinity.
We need good role models. And that is, yeah, thanks, Kevin.
Well, I was gonna actually ask you about this, not today about my stuff or,
Yeah.
but it does seem that sports in general are a place where we get to kind of play with ideas of masculinity. But the competitive sports are really limited in that sense because it's so limited what your goals can be.
Right.
But alternative sports and nature sports is kind of a type of alternative sport seem to be a place where it should be possible to kind of rethink and reconstruct ideas of gender and race and just what it is to be human and those kinds of things. What do you think about that? And I guess, what do you think about that in terms of mountaineering? Like, it seems like mountaineering might be the kind of thing where, because it's so goal-oriented, there might not be that much space to kind of play with ideas or to rethink things.
Amazingly, I was going to reference you. What's your name? Mitch? In an attempt to answer Mitch's question, because it does seem like nature sport is kind of already transcending competition as a thing. I think that the challenge with mountaineering is it's already sort of that loaded summit metaphor, but one thing we often talk about in outdoor studies classes in relation to how gender coding or just experience can be more neutral than what we're talking about here. Toxic masculinity it's just a very limited human expression. Does that make sense? Like setting the stage in relation to the group experience, in relation to consensus-based decision-making, in relation to people communicating with each other. I think those things, and this might answer Kevin Krine's question too, I think those things can diffuse that intense summit focus, which can definitely cloud reason and judgment and lead to people getting hurt. I don't want to parse out the particulars of my friend's death, but we had a really, really sketchy snowpack here in Southeast Alaska this spring, and they probably shouldn't have been up there, but anyway, I think masculinity, femininity, how we understand gender. The other piece is that there are hormones. That's just this. It's not really a debate for me, but it's like nature, nurture, which is more powerful in the creating of a human being. It's got to be both. And so testosterone is a wild thing. Thanks all. Okay, that's it.